The iPhone 7 and 7 Plus were released in September 2016, succeeding the iPhone 6s as Apple's flagship phone, having possibly the most controversial release of any of Apple's iPhones up to that point, and maybe since. While it brought the new jet black and matte black colours, a minor but clean redesign, better battery life, an extra camera on the Plus model, and more, it was also the iPhone that removed the headphone jack, a controversial decision still talked about over 8 years later. But how does the rest of the 7 and 7 Plus hold up all this time later? Taking a step back from the whole headphone jack debacle, this phone isn't too bad design-wise. Looking at the front, it features an upgraded 7-megapixel selfie camera which is now capable of 1080p video. Next to it, there's the front speaker, which now works as a proper speaker rather than just being used for calls. Moving on, there's a second-gen Touch ID home button, which is now a capacitive home button. To simplify, that means that the home button doesn't actually move when pressed, instead being static, and a taptic engine simulates a click, which the pressure of can be adjusted in settings. Speaking of pressure, the iPhone 7 and 7 Plus included a feature called 3D Touch, which modern iPhones don't have, with the iPhone XS being the last to include it. Introduced with the iPhone 6s the previous year, basically 3D Touch meant the screen could sense how much force you were applying, allowing you to access additional functions with a harder press. This is recreated with haptic touch today, where you long press an icon or menu to access extra functions, but it doesn't live up to 3D Touch, so the 7 has that going for it, I suppose. It's a shame it was removed, but it did make some sense, as many didn't know the feature even existed, and by removing it more space was freed up inside the device. It lives on with the MacBooks, including the same idea within the Force Touch trackpad, but it's not quite the same as the feature on the phone screen. On the topic of the 7 and 7 Plus's screens, they measure in at 4.7 and 5.5 inches respectively, and are noted to have a wider colour gamut than their predecessors. The iPhone 7 screen has a pixel resolution of 1334 by 750, which comes out to 326 pixels per inch, and the 7 Plus comes out to 1920 by 1080, which is 401 pixels per inch. These numbers may not make a whole lot of sense to everyone, but pretty much it means that the iPhone 7 and 7 Plus screens are pretty good, especially for 2016. They look clear and crisp, and unless you're used to using a newer Pro iPhone display, you'll be perfectly fine with a screen of this quality. Now, looking at the bottom of the device, there are the speaker holes on the right and vents on the left. These speakers, which paired to the now proper front speaker, allows the iPhone 7 to have stereo speakers, meaning that the audio can be directional and more immersive. On the side of the device there's also the lightning port to charge and run headphones off, volume buttons, silent switch and power button. Turning to the back of the device, you'll see it's made of aluminium, being the last iPhone to be made of such, as all iPhones afterward came with the clasp back to allow for wireless charging, making the iPhone 7 one of the last iPhones that feels safe to use without a case, as there's a lot less risk involved should it be dropped. Also on the back there's the 12-megapixel camera, which now offers optical image stabilization on the non-Plus iPhone, rather than being a Plus exclusive feature as it was with the 6 and 6s Plus. But talking of Plus exclusives, the iPhone 7 Plus now features a second camera lens, a telephoto lens with 2x optical zoom and up to 10x digital zoom, but this second lens lacks optical image stabilization. Overall, I would say that the cameras on the iPhone 7 and 7 Plus are perfectly fine, especially for 2016. Here, the 7 Plus I have takes perfectly fine photos and videos, and its telephoto lens is quite useful, sometimes better than my iPhone 12, which doesn't have a telephoto lens. The iPhone 7 Plus is also the first iPhone to have portrait mode, utilising the second lens. It doesn't work as well with objects as later iPhones and is better for photos of people, but still pretty nice. I use portrait mode quite a bit on my iPhone, and I'd say the 7 Plus does the job fairly well in comparison. Looking beneath the face of the 7, all of this is powered by the A10 Fusion chip, which unlike the dual-core A9 of the iPhone 6s, has 2 low power and 2 high power cores. Only 2 cores are used at one point in time, but nevertheless it allows for better efficiency over the A9. As for storage, the iPhone 7 changed the base level from 16GB to 32, a much needed change as even by 2016 16GB is a tiny amount, and while 32GB wasn't a whole lot more, it was still a welcome change, and probably enough for the time, but definitely not anymore. The storage might be one of the 7's most limiting factors all this time later. The next step up was seemingly 128GB, and if your 7 had this capacity then it's probably doing alright, but 32GB, after factoring in the storage required for the newer software, data and key apps, doesn't leave a whole lot of room left over. but if you're managing on 32GB, then props to you. RAM-wise, the iPhone 7 has the same 2GB as the previous 6S. The 7 Plus has 3GB of RAM however, being the first iPhone to offer more than 2. This RAM bump was likely to help drive the extra camera and the new features it came with, but can also help the 7 Plus still fill fast as it ages. As for battery life, the iPhone 7 contains a 1960 mAh battery, while the Plus has a 2900 mAh battery, which translates to about 3 to 5 hours and 5 to 8 hours of real-world use respectively. Obviously, your mileage may vary depending on your specific use case, and the fact they were the stats when the iPhone 7 was new, since it's now been over 8 years, so if you're still using one, you're probably finding the battery to not be doing as good anymore, especially on the regular 7 model. Once the battery hits about 80% health, you may find your phone acts up, slowing down or shutting down unexpectedly, especially when at a low battery level, which can be chalked up to the battery having deteriorated. If you really think your iPhone 7 is doing everything you still need, then Apple does offer a battery replacement for about 115 Australian dollars and 70 US dollars, which will likely get you a few more years out of your iPhone 7 as long as you're okay with no more major software updates. Yep, the iPhone 7 stopped receiving major software support with the release of iOS 16 in 2022, going from iOS 10 to iOS 15. A solid 6 years of software support, which would be fine, but the iPhone 6S also received iOS 15, meaning it got 7 years of software support, but hey, the 6S and 7 weren't so far apart in performance, so maybe it was best to leave them on iOS 15? iOS 16 was a fairly large update, and maybe it was too much? Except, yeah, the iPad 5, containing similar hardware to the iPhone 6S, and the iPad 6 and iPad 7, which contained similar hardware to the iPhone 7 and 7 Plus, all received iPadOS 16, with the iPad 6 receiving iPadOS 17, and the iPad 7 still being supported on iPadOS 18. Sure, iPadOS and iOS are technically different now, but I don't think they were so far apart that such similar specs mean one version can continue and the other remains left behind. Still, 6 years of software support is plenty, and more than any other smartphone from 2016, but it's still odd. A popular theory is that Apple continued the life of the iPad 5 and 6 to continue their 5-year minimum promise of software support, and since they're heavily used in education, ending support seemingly early, while still a long time, would lead to negative feedback from the education market. Even if this is the case, the iPad 5, 6 and 7 seemingly ran iPadOS 16 well enough, so I don't see why the iPhone 7 at least couldn't have received the update for any reason other than planned obsolescence. While 6 years is still double than most other Android phones of the time, it's still disappointing if the reason the seemingly capable device didn't receive the next update was due to planned obsolescence. Anyway, moving past my small rant, as of now, on iOS 15, the iPhone 7 still remains fairly capable. For me at least, the 7 Plus seems quite fast, even with its deteriorated battery. Plenty of apps still support iOS 15, or at least have a latest compatible version which still works well enough. For many people this will still be completely usable, especially for those who consider the iPhone 7 to be what it really is, a phone. It still makes calls and sends messages perfectly and supports plenty of popular third-party messaging apps. So if all you need out of the iPhone 7 is its functionality as a phone, you especially will be perfectly fine for a good few years to come. All things considered, the iPhone 7 and 7 Plus function perfectly fine in 2025. For me at least, it definitely doesn't feel its age. It still flies through the home screen, opening apps quickly and functioning without issue. So what are some good uses for one should you still have one lying around? Well, for starters, your old iPhone 7 could make a fairly good first phone for a kid or something. Plenty of classic mobile games and streaming apps still work, and it can do texts, calls, or FaceTime with no problem. And there's a lot less to worry about in terms of durability thanks to its aluminium back. The chance of it being damaged or broken is a lot less, but even if it does, it's nowhere near as big of an issue compared to if a much newer phone were to be damaged. Some other use cases for an old iPhone 7 could be something like a backup phone, just in case you or a family member need to borrow a phone temporarily while a new phone is ordered or being repaired. Or you could use it as a music player to leave in your car or connect it to a speaker, since it connects to Bluetooth just fine and can use apps like Apple Music or Spotify. Really, the iPhone 7 still feels extremely capable in 2025, but at the end of the day, the iPhone 7 and 7 Plus were fairly decent additions to the iPhone line, although controversial due to being the iPhone that removed the headphone jack. On its own, the 7 was a fairly solid iPhone which many people still happily use to this day, and it wasn't as big of a change as the iPhone 6 had been previously, or the iPhone 10 would be the following year, but it still brought new features to the table which we still use today. Thanks for watching. I've been away and I was able to get some nice footage of this thing while out camping, but sorry it's been a while, but I've got some stuff planned and hopefully the next video will have less of a gap. Would any of you be interested in car content? Anyways, see you next time. Bye.